But the heresies that most clearly demonstrate the apostasy of Vatican II is its teaching on the different false religions of the world. Vatican II teaches that non-Catholic sects are a means of salvation. Vatican II teaches that Muslims and Catholics together worship the true God. Vatican II teaches that one can be an atheist through no fault of his own. Vatican II praises the false religion of Hinduism. And there are many other heresies in Vatican II, and we can also see that the heresies of Vatican II have been promoted in the Vatican's official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano. This weekly newspaper contains all the official speeches and writings of the men who claim to be Pope. The Vatican has reprinted issues of their newspaper from April 4th, 1968 to the present. I have personally gone through every weekly issue of the Vatican's official newspaper from April 4th, 1968 to present. In these newspapers, one can see the utter religious indifferentism and apostasy of Vatican II promoted by the anti-popes who have reigned from Rome over the last 50 years. Paul VI's General Audience, September 5, 1973, quote, "Buddhism is one of the riches of Asia." Paul VI's speech to Buddhist spiritual leader, January 17, 1975, quote, "The Second Vatican Council has expressed sincere admiration for Buddhism in its various forms." Paul VI addressed to Buddhist Patriarch of Laos, June 8, 1973, quote, "Buddhism, the Catholic Church considers its spiritual riches with esteem, and respects and wishes to collaborate with you as religious men to bring about real peace and the salvation of man." Paul VI's speech, September 9, 1972, quote, "We would also like you to know that the Church recognizes the riches of the Islamic faith, a faith that binds us to the one God." In 1984, John Paul II visited the Buddhist temple. Before entering this temple of idolatry, John Paul II expressed how anxious he was to meet, quote, His Holiness the Supreme Buddhist Patriarch in the temple. After John Paul II entered the temple, he bowed to the Buddhist Patriarch, who sat in front of a gigantic statue of Buddha. This is apostasy. The Council of Elvira in 305 stated, quote, "It has been decreed that those who in adult age after receiving baptism shall go into the pagan temples to worship idols, which is a deadly crime and the height of wickedness, shall not be admitted to communion even at death." On August 8, 1985, John Paul II prayed with African animist witch doctors. On April 13, 1986, John Paul II traveled to the Jewish synagogue in Rome, Italy, where he took part in a Jewish religious service. John Paul II even bowed his head with the other Jews and the chief rabbi as they said a prayer for the coming of the Messiah, who they explicitly believe is not Jesus Christ. This incredible act of apostasy by John Paul II was directly connected to his heretical teaching that the Old Covenant religion is still in force. The Catholic Church teaches that with the coming of Jesus Christ and the promulgation of the gospel, the Old Covenant, that is, the agreement between God and the Jews through the mediation of Moses, ceased and was replaced with the new covenant of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's true that some aspects of the Old Covenant are still valid, because they are included in the new and eternal covenant of Jesus Christ, such as the Ten Commandments. But the Old Covenant itself, the agreement between God and the Jewish people, ceased with the coming of the Messiah. Therefore, to say that the Old Covenant is still valid is to assert that Judaism is a true religion and that Jesus Christ is not really the Messiah. It is also to deny defined Catholic dogma, such as the teaching of the Council of Florence, which define ex cathedra, that the old law is now dead, and that those who attempt to practice it, namely the Jews, cannot be saved. Pope Benedict XIV, ex quo primum, number 61, March 1, 1756, quote, "The first consideration is that the ceremonies of the Mosaic law were abrogated by the coming of Christ, and that they can no longer be observed without sin after the promulgation of the gospel." Pope Pius XII, Mystici Corpus Christi, numbers 29 and 30, June 29, 1943, quote, "The New Testament took the place of the old law which had been abolished. On the cross, then, the old law died." Pope Benedict XIV, ex quo primum, number 59, quote, However, they are not attempting to observe the precepts of the old law, which, as everybody knows, have been revoked by the coming of Christ. In an address to Jews in West Germany, November 17, 1980, John Paul II spoke of, quote, the old covenant never revoked by God. John Paul II also taught this in his New Catechism, paragraph 121, quote, for the old covenant has never been revoked. John Paul II asked his Jewish friend Gilbert Levine to conduct a Jewish religious service in the Vatican. With John Paul II and the Rabbi of Rome in attendance, a Jewish service took place. During this service they sang Kol Nidra, the prayer sung on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Many Jews also lit candles during this ceremony. Levine remarked, quote, it was like I was in a Jewish liturgical service in the Vatican. It was a night of prayer, of Jewish prayer. After the ceremony ended, John Paul II called for Levine to receive the Vatican knighthood. Levine became a knight commander of the Equestrian Order of St. Gregory the Great. Cardinal Lustiger of John Paul II's Vatican II Church bestowed the honor. Lustiger himself stated in a 1981 interview, quote, I am a Jew. For me, the two religions are one. During an interview on CNN's Larry King Live, April 4, 2005, Gilbert Levine revealed that John Paul II gave his family a menorah and sent his sons letters of congratulations on the days that they had their bar mitzvahs. He also said that he received a letter from Cardinal Walter Casper of the Vatican II Church, in which Casper told Levine's family to be proud of their Jewish heritage and live it out to the full. Gilbert Levine has stated that John Paul II never gave him the slightest indication that he wanted to convert him. John Paul II's best friend was his lifelong friend Jerzy Kluger, who was a Jew. As a youth, John Paul II played soccer goalie with Kluger on the Jewish team against the Catholics. After John Paul II's October 16, 1978 election as antipope, the very first, quote, papal audience that John Paul II gave was to Kluger's family. Kluger also stated that John Paul II never gave him the slightest indication he wanted to convert him. Kluger credits his lifelong relationship with John Paul II with making him feel, quote, more Jewish. Another thing that John Paul II did constantly was call Jews and Muslims the children of Abraham. This is a blasphemy against Jesus Christ. St. Paul clearly teaches in Galatians 3:29, quote, and if you be Christ's, then you are the seed of Abraham. Only those who accept Jesus Christ are the children of Abraham. On October 27, 1986, John Paul II prayed with 100 different religious leaders in Assisi, Italy. The entire event was the idea of John Paul II. During this meeting, the Dalai Lama placed a Buddhist statue on the tabernacle in the Church of St. Francis. Among the various false religious leaders at this event were rabbis, Islamic muftis, Buddhist monks, Shintoists, assorted Protestant ministers, animists, Jainists, and others. This activity has always been condemned by the Catholic Church as mortally sinful and apostasy from the true faith. Pope Pius XI, Mortalium Animos, No. 10, January 6, 1928, quote, this apostolic see has never allowed its subjects to take part in the assemblies of non-Catholics. On May 14, 1999, John Paul II bowed to and kissed the Koran, the Muslims' holy book, which blasphemes the Trinity and denies the divinity of Jesus Christ. This is apostasy.